Welcome back to Second Breakfast, and welcome back to our Dune coverage. This might be our final episode, depending on how things go. This is our discussion of Dune Messiah,
Sorry, go ahead.
Which is the second Dune novel.
Yes. And it's important to note that at the time of recording, we have not yet seen Dune Part 2. We're seeing it, I think, 2 days from now. So everything we're talking about right now is just Cam's opinion of the books that he's read and the movie Part 1 that we have both seen. So just keep that in mind.
Yes.
Also, if you haven't listened to our other Dune episodes, you should do that before you continue on today. We did an episode on the first movie back when it came out a few years ago. And then we've also been doing some book coverage Cam has read. We did it in 3 parts for the first Dune novel, books 1, 2, and 3. And now Cam has just finished Dune Messiah, which I'm sure he's going to talk about as really it being a book 4 of this whole Paul Atreides cycle. Am I correct in that?
That's what I was expecting, but it really does feel like its own thing. It doesn't feel like an addendum or an expansion. It very much feels like its own project.
Cool.
This is the end of the first saga within Dune. You know that there are big time jumps, and after this we go into Children of Dune and God Emperor of Dune, all these things. Those are sort of different stories, sort of following different characters. Dune Messiah is going to be the basis of what is presumably, I mean, it hasn't been greenlit, but it has been greenlit.
It all but has, yeah.
They're already saying they're like doing a script and writing music for it. The third Denis Villeneuve, Hans Zimmer Dune movie will cover Messiah, and that'll be the trilogy of Paul's arc. So Sweet. This is closing out that story. Not sure if we're going to do episodes on the rest of the books. I'm already reading them, but this one definitely is the end of that cycle of our coverage talking about Paul. So I have made this as spoiler-free as humanly possible.
Awesome.
Because Maggie hasn't seen the second movie or read the book.
Yeah.
And for all of you out there, because I know these books are doorstops.
But it certainly, we might end up spoiling everything that happens through the first movie. Right?
Sure,
like
sure.
There's some things that are going to come up, as all of our discussions have been. So.
I'm going to talk about ideas and some concepts, but I'm not going to spoil anything plot related.
Okay, great.
It's been a bit of a tightrope thing.
I really admire
notes.
the work you've done to prepare your discussions for these.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. So starting with that first point you just asked, is this a part 4 because the first Dune novel was split into 3 books, or is this a full-blown sequel? I really have enjoyed doing these sort of Dune diary episodes because I've been wrong so often.
Yeah.
And I think when we started doing the podcast, I would have been really resistant to that because it felt like I was going to do an episode on work of art, I wanted it to be my final say. I wanted to have every thought and theory possible, like done and polished for that discussion. Having done this 338 times now, I think I've evolved past that, where I enjoy being wrong. I enjoy the process of discovery, the conversation with the audience. Comment on YouTube, Patreon, or email us.
Right.
Seriously, though, that is a huge part of this now.
Yeah, the reflecting on the things you said in the past and the ideas you had and now what you have at this moment. Because we've had that happen a lot, where we've changed our minds about things. We've like gone back and said, hey, remember a year ago when we said this thing? Well, actually, it turns out that I think this thing. And that's been really fun to live and grow with.
It's a dialogue.
And like that's the way that you process art in real life, but when you're doing it like this where you're documenting things, it kind of helps you, process a little bit more intentionally. It's fun.
And my favorite part of our long form discussions, whether it has been through Tolkien, The Witcher, or Game of Thrones, is these long-standing theories and bigger ideas that we grind away at and evolve and tweak over time.
Yeah.
And we work together on all those things. So that's what I want this episode to be. It's not about what happens plot-wise in Messiah. I'm avoiding all of those spoilers. It's about how the ideas we've talked about in the previous 3 Dune book discussions have matured through this newest novel. So I want to start with Shakespeare. And this is another, I'm very happy to say I was wrong again about Shakespeare.
Awesome.
I was predicting last time that this was going to evolve into Richard III. Mm-hmm. And I'm very glad. As much as I love Richard, and I'd love to see Herbert's version of Richard, we're jumping 12 years into the future with Messiah. There was a 2-year jump within the middle of the first Dune book. This one is beefier. And then I think it's 9 years to get to Children.
Oh, wow.
The next novel. So 12 years into the future, I'm not going to say what's happened within those 12 years, but very important stuff.
I'm sure.
But we open here not joining Paul and finding out what's happened with Paul. We join a group of conspirators plotting against him.
Ooh.
Things are very cloak and dagger. A lot of new characters, no soft introduction. We're just thrust into these new dynamics.
Really cool.
And these new major players. And from that first chapter, I knew that I was wrong expecting this to be Richard. We're playing with a very different Shakespearean historical tragedy. I thought we were going into Richard, but after this 12-year time jump, we're going into late stage Julius Caesar.
I was going to say, okay, very, very, and you love Julius
which
Caesar.
I adore.
Yes.
And I got to do a study abroad thing in undergrad, and I got to see Julius Caesar at the Globe.
That's so cool.
So that's I have an intense relationship with that particular play.
Yeah.
But this is not just a gesture. I think it's fairly overt the way we're playing with the themes and ideas and story beats of Julius Caesar here, complete with some of the archetypal riffs that we've played with so far. There's a character introduced just nonchalantly, two-thirds of the way through this book, who is a classic jester or fool character.
Nice. To
the point that the character's even speaking in verse sometimes.
Oh, wow.
Or in riddles.
Yeah.
There's that poetic, sort of unknowable quality to the character, and they riff, and I'm very excited to see this person in the movie, and I know exactly who they should cast for it, but it's a spoiler to say it out loud.
Okay.
So what Herbert's doing here is building out his royal court. Because that's what you need with Julius Caesar, right? It's
well, of course, yes.
It's all of the friends and enemies and allies and all of that like heightened, deadly political intrigue. And that's what I'm here for anyway. As much as I enjoy a good sandworm, I'm here for the political intrigue, the cloak and dagger.
Yes, you love that.
So as the story shifts to being, instead of, riding the sandworms and that kind of action, this is less of an action-packed blockbuster kind of book. There are set pieces, but fewer. I would say this is much more of the politicking and the scheming and the murder plots and the stuff that really gets us going.
Okay. Well, I have a question for you about this Julius Caesar thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know the end of Dune Messiah. I feel like I can probably predict how it ends, especially based on this Julius Caesar connection. So I'm not really interested in, does it follow the plot of Julius Caesar in terms of like how it ends up? My question really is, did you find that once you had drawn that connection, it sounds like from the first chapter of this book, did you find that going through you were kind of like, oh, I know how this is going to play out now, so I'm bored by this? Or was Herbert like doing interesting, unexpected twists or reworkings of it that kept you intrigued?
Yeah, it doesn't follow like beat for beat the plot of Julius Caesar. I think it starts opening like that on those conspirators.
Sure.
It almost had a feeling of the Three Witches because it was mostly new characters scheming against someone who you were sort of narratively on the side of. But the further it went through the book, it really became its own thing. And because so much of it is about prophecy and Paul trying to control what's going to happen in the future, anticipate what's going to happen, avert these plots against him, there was this will they, won't they, with the prophecies of, is this going to end up in that classical Shakespearean tragic history sort of way? Are these plots against him going to be successful? Are his desired futures and outcomes going to come to pass? Do we want that to happen? Whose side are we on? It was more that sort of question.
All right.
I never felt like we were on rails following a traditional Shakespearean structure.
Great. Okay. But it was like there enough that it was interesting, but it wasn't so much there that you were like, okay, well, I know how this is going to go now. Okay.
Yes. Yes. So much of it is about these inflection points and decisions trying to avoid certain futures. And the idea of the mentat being the sort of human computer who gathers all this data and tries to inform you and I mean, they're sort of like the Hand of the King.
Yes.
Those sort of characters who are the brains of the operation. Because Paul is sort of a mentat and he has all of these visions, I think he's doing all of that work in his own head. And you're so spun up within his visions, within his thoughts and fears that it's never cleanly one thing. But as the story shifts to council meetings and plots, there's this quote from Paul. He says, I was really paying attention to kind of the smaller quotes here. There weren't as many like quotes that you'd stick on the back of a paperback like there were in the first book.
Okay.
But these smaller lines really spoke to me, and I tried to dot them through my notes here. It was, once more the drama begins.
Nice.
And I thought that spoke to this sort of Shakespearean reset that keeps happening throughout this series. And structurally, this book feels a lot more theatrical than Dune did. I really loved Dune. I loved the world building of that first novel, but it was dense. It was sweeping. And I think part of that Shakespearean architecture that I'm always looking for is a certain brevity.
Yeah.
Because the plays, even the long ones, aren't that long.
Sure, yeah.
So going into Messiah being a much shorter book, I think I could find that more. The chapters are much closer to being scenes than they ever have been before. I think some of the chapters were multiple scenes stitched together, sort of a relay race through different outcomes and repercussions in the first book. But here they really feel like scenes. And you have these Shakespearean, not tropes or cliches, but you have important scenes of eavesdropping. You have individual interactions. A scene or a chapter can be one character visiting another character. You have these royal consultations. You have these little conspiracies and whispering, evil characters. You have pointed reflections. I think this was one of the big Shakespearean things I was looking for as we got towards some sort of breaking point for what was going to happen with the current cast of characters before we zoomed ahead into the future. There are a couple scenes of prowling. I think if you're looking at Paul as the Messiah, then you need to see him grapple with that.
Yeah, sure.
Him being called the Messiah, him feeling like a Messiah, all of those ideas, you need to see him sort of chewing the scenery. And there are solo scenes of him prowling around, and you're swirling in his head with his private regrets, his paranoia, his fears. That's what I wanted. That is the drama I was looking for here.
Sort of like that soliloquy thing that you talked about, I think, book 2 or 3 of Dune, talking about the ecologist and having an occasional scene like that where it's a solo character thinking their thoughts out loud to the audience, or in this case, just in the book to you, the reader.
Yes.
To sort of give explanation of what's happening internally and to sort of reflect, encourage the audience to reflect upon the ideas of the story.
Yeah, it's a doubling down on all the things I liked. And those are where I was initially drawing comparisons to Shakespeare's tragedies. I think it's now pointedly about the histories. With that Caesar framework, Julius Caesar is a main character in that play, but he's not the main character at all.
Oh, who is it, Brutus?
I don't think there is a singular main character. There are multiple narrative leads.
Oh, interesting.
You're following some of the conspirators. You're following some of the characters' wives. You're following the whole tapestry. It's very much an ensemble piece.
Okay, sort of like, that's not the first time Shakespeare's done that. You got Much Ado About Nothing and Midsummer, like that. That makes sense.
The tragedies are much more based around singular protagonists than the histories are. So I think part of that adjustment is following that lead.
Okay.
And in that style, in that sense here, Paul is receding in the narrative.
Okay, yeah.
He's not our singular heroic lead anymore. I mean, I think Herbert is setting that tone by having him not appear in the first chapter or two.
Sure.
Paul is one of the lead storylines. And that's pretty daring to do in the first sequel after the first book becomes this runaway bestseller.
Definitely.
He's just one concerned party. And there's a moment, because I was telling you when I was reading the book that Dune takes place within the same history as Earth, but a long time later.
Okay.
So the stuff that happens in our world is sort of ancient history to them.
Makes sense.
And there are some references. In the first book, there are some references to the Catholic Bible.
Yes, I remember that.
That's sort of as far as it goes, talking about our world. But obviously, his name is Paul.
Yeah. Oh,
there's a biblical reference there.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's why people always point out, why is the guy's name Paul in this big epic?
Yeah.
It's because of the biblical thing.
That makes sense.
But there are other references here. And I'm not going to say who, but they're really interesting.
Cool.
And I can't wait to see how Villeneuve does them on screen, because it could be very heavy-handed or it could be very poignant.
Do you know the story of Paul in the Bible?
Not in any great detail.
Well, I think it might help your interpretation of things. So this is based on my Sunday school knowledge from 20 years ago, so bear with. But he started out as a man named Saul, who was this sort of, he's a New Testament character, so post Jesus Christ. He's this guy named Saul who's basically an amoral, not doing well kind of guy. He's on this walk to somewhere, and then God comes to him in this like vision, and basically Saul is struck by the presence of God, and he sees him so directly and overtly, and like it's too much, and he becomes blind, and then he sort of like has this moment of like intense religious conversion, and then he can see again, and he becomes Paul, and then he becomes this oh shit, was he a disciple? He must have been a disciple, I don't know, but either way he wrote a lot of the New Testament, and he basically just becomes this sort of advocate for the Christian faith, and has this big turn. So it's interesting, I'm saying that because of what you talked about at the end of Dune, which is where Paul seems to be making a turn in a different direction, and so it almost seems like an inverse. So I'm curious about that connection.
Yeah, I think it's not an accident that name was chosen.
Yeah.
And I'll ask you not to read the comments on the YouTube video to know which things I'm saying happen there.
You got it.
But yeah, no, that totally clocks with what's happening here.
Okay, fascinating.
But there are references to other sorts of historical figures. It's not just oblique references to the Bible, and it's not just echoes to characters or historical figures who got Elizabethan theatrical productions named after them.
Yeah.
It's not there are other historical figures and leaders who are referenced pointedly, like specifically in this book, that it almost felt jarring because they're people who have existed in the last couple hundred years of our contemporary history, and Paul is referencing them.
Interesting.
As like possible touchstones for leadership styles and accomplishments.
Huh.
And I was trying to figure out what was happening here, because it felt too overt for Herbert to just be making these comparisons. Like,
right.
It's not Napoleon, but let's use Napoleon.
Let's use that as
sort
an
of
example.
a fill-in. Like,
okay.
if he was just saying Paul is like Napoleon or Alexander the Great,
Yeah, like cool.
and he's not saying that.
Yeah.
They're like, here, I'll use one. One of them is Genghis Khan.
Oh,
He's
okay.
talking about something about Genghis Khan and
Wow.
that sort of conquest and those styles of leadership and approach to controlling people and thoughts and the populace.
Wow.
Well, I was trying to figure out what the effect was of those sort of references that felt almost like the references you and I would make talking about a work of art.
Yeah.
Not the type of references that a creative would bury into the dialogue of a project.
Right, yeah.
It almost felt too much like a commentary to be something overt in the narrative.
Okay.
And I think the effect, or maybe the intention there, if I can reach for that, is scope. I think it's Herbert trying to expand the scope of influences upon this story and upon this character past the obvious Shakespeare stuff that we can grapple onto. I think it's him trying to push beyond a literary canon. I found out in reading more about Frank Herbert that he was a political speechwriter in the 50s before he started writing this series. And obviously that informed a lot of his critique about leadership and about charismatic leaders. And I think that that's why this story becomes something of a warning or a fable. So maybe that's why he was referencing the historical figures in that way, because by pointing out that there are more leaders in human history than the few that were brought to an impossible fictional height by Shakespeare, by broadening your horizons past that, I think it makes characters and leaders feel insignificant on an individual level. I think it demystifies them. The more leaders that you reference, I think the less unique any of them become.
Sure, yeah, because they just become one in a thousand instead of like just the one that you mentioned.
Because there's this, obviously being called Dune Messiah, there's this idea of deification.
Yeah.
And characters being larger than life. And I think maybe Herbert was just slightly sticking the pin into the balloon there and trying to deflate some of our expectations and making more of a cyclical point.
Sure. Well, and the idea that like all of these leaders that have been mentioned are eventually just dead and lost to history. And you know, I mean, they live on in history technically because we remember them, but they die like everybody else, and often they die young. And like that's it for them. And then another one comes along and does something different and changes things again. So it's that cyclical thing that you're talking about, and it it doesn't make them feel irrelevant, but it does remove some of their potency in terms of like thinking that there's going to be a new guy who's going to come along and do something else and be more important than you.
And when you're zoomed out enough on the timeline, those individuals start to feel like reincarnations of each other.
Sure, yeah.
There is this sort of echo chamber effect where they start to largely feel the same. And again, I don't want to spoil the ones we're talking about here because that is a plot thing, and we could talk about that. And maybe we can talk about that later once you've read the book.
Yeah.
But despite any charismatic leader's revolutionary intentions, most of them succumb to greed, luxury, paranoia, oppression, deception.
Sure.
All of the things that fell the great Shakespearean protagonists and leaders.
Yes.
So I think maybe that's how he's making this warning against leadership. I'm glad that he expanded beyond my usual points of reference.
Yeah.
Because I think it makes it a much more well-rounded critique.
Here's a random question. Does he, Herbert is referencing actual figures from our history in his book, right? But of course, this story is meant to take place far, far after the 60s, not to mention right now, the 2020s. Does he mention any like made up leaders or heroes or major figures from like the future, but this book's past? Or does he just mention stuff pre like 1960, basically?
It's mostly that.
That's funny.
Yeah, it's mostly because there's.
I mean, what can he do? I'm just curious if he like invented a few from like, I don't know, the 2070s or something. I don't know.
No, and I think that's part of why I keep calling this series so accessible, because it speaks to those almost cultural references.
Yeah.
Because he's naming people that everyone reading the book recognizes.
Yeah, even if you don't know a ton about Genghis Khan or whatever, you've heard that name and you can easily look it up to learn more.
Right, and the people that are referenced, there's such an implication in like the list of names that Paul trots out that it develops Paul's character as well.
Okay.
And it does something to the audience. But if it was an endless list of fictional people and you had like 12 footnotes explaining, the Silmarillion of this world.
You'd have to explain what those are instead of, because like if you hear a random name, you're like, oh, wait, what's that one?
Maybe that's a good way to make this point. I'm sorry if I've been talking in circles. I just don't want to ruin the stuff in this book.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
The fact that, I guess that is what I was just trying to say. The fact that so much of the Lord of the Rings history, because that is where we started with the show here, is a history way before anything interesting that happened in Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
That it is buried in footnotes or appendices or the Silmarillion.
Yes.
I think Frank Herbert's project, which was happening, in the 60s, that's not incredibly far off from Lord of the Rings.
No, it's not.
And the more I read this, it is the American Lord of the Rings. It is the sci-fi Lord of the Rings. Whatever qualifier you want to make, I think it's on that level.
Yeah.
I think Frank Herbert's achievement that goes beyond what Tolkien managed is that he's doing that history work in real time in narrative form.
Yeah, you don't have to look it up in an appendix or in the Silmarillion or whatever. Yeah.
Because he's got 6 books that he finished, and then his son wrote 1,000 more. But those 6 books are all beefcakes. Messiah is the only one that's short. And even short, it's 350 pages. But
it's average.
The other ones are all doorstops. And some of those time jumps are thousands of years. So that's all the Silmarillion stuff. That's all the things from the appendices, but done in narrative.
Yeah.
Not as this sort of... I know the Silmarillion's not half-assed, but...
No,
it's like an outline of a story.
It's not a true narrative the way that the Lord of the Rings is. Yeah,
and I think there's
more of a history. It's really what it is. It's a history,
but it's more effective, obviously. And I imagine if Tolkien had 400 years of life in him, I wonder if he would have written out some of the history parts in a fuller narrative.
Yeah, I wonder that too. Well, even like George R.R. Martin, who's often we bring comparisons to a lot for lots of reasons, but we're reading him right now. Think about his like Fire and Blood and his other like histories that he's written in his Westeros world. Like they're also not written out like full narratives. I've read a little bit of Fire and Blood. It's narrative. It's not dry, but it's not like a story that follows characters. It's more just like an outline, like you're saying. So in the same style as Tolkien.
The more I read Dune, I've always considered George R.R. Martin the number one Tolkien fan. Yeah. Mostly the middle names.
Of course he is, yeah.
And the references and things, but I see him very much as of the Herbert school. Because if you look at the size and number of books in his life's project series.
Yes, sure.
They are that massive scope real-time history.
I was gonna say he does incorporate history and backstory and explanation and context into his narrative very, very well. He just also happens to have these other histories that he's just decided to write out as well.
But by following so many POVs, I think George R. R. Martin is chasing consequence and repercussion throughout the world.
Yeah.
Which is a way of constructing a history.
Yes. That's
so
true.
I think he's borrowing from the Herbert school as much as he is from Tolkien.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's sort of my point on trying to figure out what these historical references are doing, what these Shakespearean references are accomplishing as we move from tragedies into histories. And that's sort of my beat on that. This next point is, again, me trying to abstract a spoiler. There's an idea, and I'm not going to tell you who, but there's a thing in this book. There's this concept that's introduced called a Ghola.
Ghola?
Which is a new type of character.
Okay.
And this type of character, I'm just going to talk about the idea of the idea here, is an unparalleled escalation of the idea you and I have been playing with for years of an echo.
Okay.
Of some character's actions feeling like an echo of another character. Echoes across storylines, distillation echoes, all these things we play with. The idea of ghosts or shadows. All of these, I mean, if you've seen our thumbnails on Instagram or the infographics that we do for every episode, you're familiar with these ideas. The Ghola is the most explicit, overt, over-the-top escalation of those ideas. I was reminded of the Shakespearean, but a walking shadow, that kind of idea.
Okay, nice.
It is the most painful sort of poetry and rhyme. It's a very challenging idea, and it gives us an incredibly rewarding, totally new type of character work. There's a new type of character who is a Ghola, who, as you see our established principal characters react to the Ghola, they regress and reflect in a way that no characters are really able to unless you're like Smeagol talking to yourself in the pond.
Sure, yeah.
Like it's this character who is a character in their own right, but they also feel like a walking thought experiment.
Oh, okay, cool.
And almost a conceptual affront. Like there is a lot more philosophy in Messiah than there was in Dune, and I loved how much there was in Dune.
Yeah.
But it is still conversational. And to have a character who is a Ghola here, it means you're almost talking to the ideas.
Oh, nice. Okay, I see what
There's
you're
a character who is the voice of a certain type of philosophy.
Okay.
From a perspective that feels conceptual.
That's really fun.
And
and is this what you were saying yesterday? You said how you know that the books kind of get really weird as they go on, but it turns out that's what you're liking. Is this part of that weird thing?
it's one of them, because there's another type of new character who I'm not going to spoil, who I think you will... I can't even finish that sentence. There's another type of new character who a lot of other characters refer to as an abomination.
Oh dear, okay.
That's a little wink and a nod to people who've read the books who are listening. But that abomination character and this Ghola type of character, the way these two interact becomes this like feedback loop for ideas and characterization and philosophy and challenges. And that was just catnip for me.
That sounds great for
I
you.
adored that. And so much of this circles back because this new Ghola type of character became everything I was looking for in our previous discussions with Shakespeare. This first half of the episode is just me sort of reacting to being gloriously wrong about Shakespeare.
Yeah.
But this Ghola is the most dynamic character within this book. And I think the performance in the movie is going to be challenging and subtle and just incredible. And I'm so excited. That's maybe the thing I'm most excited for out of a potential Dune Messiah adaptation, because this character, like I said, is an escalation of the echo or ghost idea. And at different points in this story, that means that they are the ghost of Hamlet Sr. or the ghost of Banquo or all of the ghosts of Richard III's victims or Falstaff. There are so many, all of those like MVP supporting cast members of all the Shakespeare plays that I've referenced thus far. Most of those characters are whipped up together into this Ghola.
Nice.
And I'm so excited for that to
Cool.
happen on screen and for us to be able to talk about that. I hope I've obscured it enough.
Yeah, I mean, you've intrigued me, and I'm curious, and you've helped me understand kind of what it accomplishes, but I still have no idea what you're talking about, and that's perfect.
That's the sweet spot. So
You did a good job.
the next idea I want to play with is a question. These are more quotes. So there's a person talking to Paul, and that's all you need to know. And the person says, "Can one destroy a god?"
Okay.
And in answering this sort of, philosophical prompt, basically, Paul almost resentfully references, quote, "the human situation." Like I'm imagining him kind of holding his nose.
Ugh, the human situation.
And the person, that's an interesting, distinct, he could have said the human condition, but that is
Sure.
not what he means.
Situation. That's funny.
Situation, that's a fantastic bit of writing just there.
It
But
is.
the other person on the side of this conversation eventually doubles down on the critique and on the challenge there, going from "can one destroy a god" to eventually saying, "what religion and self-interest cannot hide, governments can."
Oh.
So it's an escalation of these critiques while bringing in that self-interest point, which felt like an escalation of what we talked about in The Witcher for a year and a half.
Yeah.
But with this religion angle that we've never really talked about explicitly. I mean, we talk about religion sometimes with Problem of Evil stuff.
Yeah.
But
we talked about it a lot in Tolkien. We talked a lot about religion there.
But we've never had a straight Messiah character
Yeah.
like
no,
we
never.
have here,
Never.
especially where it's in the title.
Yeah, truly.
And I think the way that this book frames Paul as a Messiah invites so many of these great conversations. In my notes, I called it a flood of lesser evils and greater goods. Because Paul at once is both, and I mean, you've seen this even from the first movie, he is the first victim of prophecy as well as the first perpetrator of it. Because if you see a possible future laid out in front of you, you can either act in a way that can bring that to pass, or you can change it in order to rig things in your favor.
Right. Yeah.
And depending on the judgment of the individual in that position, that can make you a savior or the destroyer of worlds.
Right,
you
yeah.
get into the Oppenheimer position.
Certainly.
And I think that is the feint and the tease throughout this story. Paul is tortured by visions of dark futures and this golden path future. And all of the choices he makes, even the tough ones, seem like they are justifying his course. So even if he does something bad, he can say that he was doing it because he saw a worse option.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that challenges sort of the humanity of the character. Because if you pile up a bunch of good things you're doing and you pile up a bunch of bad things you're doing, there are two ways we can look at you. And I think this character as a whole becomes a warning not just against charismatic leaders, political leaders, governments who strong-arm the people, but an argument against any sort of interweaving of religion and politics.
Nice.
Because we've seen how the Fremen legend is... you've seen over the course of the first movie how they look at Paul.
Yeah.
And
It's
how they come to follow.
very religious coded. Yeah.
And that there's a slippery slope there of religious justification.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by first victim and perpetrator of prophecy.
Okay. Yeah, I see.
And every time he does something bad in the name of a greater good or a lesser evil, I want to condemn him. And Herbert just cuts it with a bit of humanity. One of the quotes I wrote down here is he's talking about a female character.
Okay.
Who I'm not going to name. And
Yes,
he says,
please don't.
how little she understood the bitter choice. Selecting among agonies, he thought, made even lesser agonies near unbearable.
Huh.
So he's aware of that lesser evil thing,
Yes.
but he's saying even the lesser evil can be unbearable.
Oh, interesting.
So there's an awareness of making these sort of measured and destructive choices. So even if on paper what he's doing is bad, does it make it okay if he regrets it or sees that?
Yeah, right. That's really interesting. It's not just I get why he's doing what he's doing. It makes you question it in a more complex way. That's cool.
And there's never I mean, there feels like there are straight answers at certain points in the book where you want to just condemn one particular action or praise one particular action and look at the alternatives and argue in his favor or argue against him. And this is what I've enjoyed so much, because there's this question throughout the book. It's not asking if Paul is the Messiah. It's asking if the Messiah, Paul, is powerless to stop or control the future. Is he trapped on one particular course? Is he, like Macbeth before him, poisoned by prophecy, or the mind meddling of the Bene Gesserit or the Guild or any of these other forces sort of hanging over him? Is he past the point of no return? Is prophecy like a light switch, and after you make this one really important decision, you're just on rails for the rest of your life, and it's already been decided? Those are like the questions we're asking, even as we grapple with like the individual morality of this character.
Wow.
You can never tell if you're locked into this like deterministic death spiral. And every time I get close to like, well, I can fully condemn Paul now, or I could try to justify what's happening, the story cuts in with that question. Listen to this quote.
Okay.
This is from Paul's mind. Any delusions of free will, capitalized, any delusions of free will he harbored now must be merely the prisoner rattling his cage. His curse lay in the fact that he saw the cage. He saw it.
Huh. Can you read it again? I need to hear it one more time.
Any delusions of free will he harbored now must be merely the prisoner rattling his cage.
Oh, okay.
His curse lay in the fact that he saw the cage. He saw it.
Interesting.
Like, these complications, the reason I'm kind of staging this inner struggle that I'm having throughout the book is that this is, I think, the great achievement of Dune Messiah. Frank Herbert's Paul is never just a critique of power or just a critique of religion. He's never just a thought experiment. This is still a character study.
Yeah, right.
One of those other short little lines, and this maybe is my favorite one of the book, I mean, it's just a tiny little thing. It's not like a thesis that's being built to. It's not this bumper sticker quote. Is the line, drama was a questionable thing.
Okay.
And I think if you are a political speechwriter who becomes a fiction writer and you want to write about this like warning or fable about leaders, about government or politics, you could write something that feels like a manifesto or a screed or a pamphlet or any of that stuff.
Sure.
But that isn't questionable. That isn't something that invites questions and interpretation. People can argue it, but then it's just a comment section on Facebook.
Yeah.
That quote, though, drama was a questionable thing. Because this is a narrative, because this is a group of fictional characters making decisions and struggling and failing and succeeding and not understanding their own actions, because it is drama more than ever as we go into this endgame Shakespeare stuff, it is questionable. It is messy. It is engaging.
Yeah.
And the fact that it never devolves into proselytizing or lecturing, because it is always a character study, because he always complicates Paul. It's one of the most engaging portraits I've ever read in fiction.
That's very, very cool. And I think that's when a book is most, or any story, is most successful at getting you to think, or just not even getting you to think about ideas, is most successful in general, is when the way the story is told, the things that happen to the characters, the decisions they make, everything that happens, makes you really, really think about ideas, maybe even presents you with an opinion about those ideas, gives you a thesis statement or fun questions to chew on, but it's still coming back to the characters. And it doesn't just become a like soapbox morality play, because that gets so tedious. And I think that's what a lot of stories now, like in the 2010s, 2020s, are really trying to do and doing really poorly, is they're so invested in the message they want to get across, in the ideals they want to express, or even in the questions they want to ask. But they just end up using the characters as vehicles to transmit those messages, and are not engaging with and experimenting with and relishing in the characters themselves.
Yes.
And they're not bringing it, and they're removing the individual from the story, from the equation. And it's only, these people just become archetypes to express ideas and not actual humans or or whatever it is your story is about. That human beings, people that are also having to grapple with these really big ideas.
They're not like scarecrows for you to shadow box your politics at. And I think it demands this really difficult form of multitasking. There was an afterword that I read at just when I was starting Children of Dune. There was a little thing from Frank Herbert, and he was talking about spending 6 years researching and plotting Dune before he started writing it.
Wow.
And I think that's the greatest compliment here, is that he's as good at politics as he is at storytelling. And you have to be able to do both of those things to do a story like this.
Yeah, you do.
And I want to make one final point here about prophecy as we wrap up. These are sort of more general thoughts about the book as we come to a close here. Dune Messiah, far more than the first book, Dune, made its prophecies feel alive. In that these possible futures feel imminent and fluid and unseen. It made me feel like I was not trying to, I was talking about a minute ago trying to like justify or condemn Paul's actions. I'm still doing that, but here I felt like I was dodging bullets here and piecing together prophecies. I talked about the 12-year time jump here, and the way that Herbert backfills the time jump, it's not like he has a little press release saying,
a recap.
This is what's happened.
That's what you missed on Glee.
Yeah, like how long have we been brothers? It's not that overt in the way he tells you what's happened.
Yeah.
It is so subtle and lethal. You piece together the revelations and horrors and wonders that have happened within these 12 years slowly. To the point that there's a major character from the first book who's just not in the second book. There's more than one who's just like, their name isn't even in the book for like 250 pages.
Wow.
And I was thinking of it the whole time, it's like you're waiting for the sword of Damocles above your head.
Yeah.
But all of those little questions are answered, and he's weaponizing that waiting. I talked about this in the discussion of the first book, saying after the scattering of the Atreides Fellowship with that big Harkonnen raid, I was waiting to see when all of the big lieutenants, all of Paul's like father figures, when they would come back into the picture.
Yeah.
And in that book, they do all eventually resurface, but he plays with you. Every time you're meeting a new character, maybe he won't use the name for a few paragraphs. So you start thinking, is this person? Is this that person who I've been waiting to see?
Right.
And then sometimes he'll give you what you want, and sometimes it'll be very much not what you want.
Yeah.
He's doing that here on a much grander scale.
Wow. Awesome.
With much bigger players than just sort of lieutenant father figures in the first book, to the point that these backfills from the time jump, they feel like landmines buried throughout the narrative, or nested within these individual character vignettes or scenes, submerged with, the narrative as it goes has this increasing reliance on visions of the future, and sometimes that's where characters will pop back up, and you don't know quite what's real or what's not. And I made sure to like underline this in my notes. The effect of this in the book can be dizzying, but it is never confusing.
Okay, amazing.
And that is the miracle, maybe, of how he's doing this.
That's impressive, yeah.
It's such a tightrope
yeah.
for Herbert to be walking here, and he's tap dancing through the whole book. It's incredible storytelling. He's tightening this vice, trapping us and Paul in these future, locked on these paths. Sometimes it feels like we're being trapped in a room with Paul when we don't really want to be near him at this moment.
Sure, yeah.
It's incredibly flexible and dynamic storytelling. Wow. I started with the Shakespeare comparisons, and I want to sort of end reflecting on that. This is not a book about plots and schemes.
Okay.
Not really. I think ultimately it's a book about trying to outrun your own shadow. It's a haunting and lethal story. And even though this book is much shorter than Dune, less than half, I think, the page count.
Yeah.
It somehow feels even more classical and arched and Shakespearean. Like this second novel is not just an addendum or a coda, like we were talking about in our previous discussion.
Yeah.
This is the next installment in this series, and very much a worthy successor here. It's more curious than Dune. It's more philosophical, and it's certainly more challenging.
That's amazing.
And when you talk about this as a mainstream series that is going to be, the second movie is going to be the biggest movie of 2024.
Sure.
Who knows how big Messiah will be when it arrives. This is aggressively weird. When I talked about the Ghola and the Abomination and some of those, the Fool and some of the other ideas I'm not spoiling, this is big swings.
Okay.
And it's so unsentimental. It's unapologetic. He'll just introduce weird shit and just keep on marching.
Wow.
Like, not a moment of, let's take a moment, let's ingratiate this into our world. He just trusts you to sprinting.
Go along with it. Yeah.
And there's a confidence here that I think you can feel. That he's been in this world for a long time, 6 years of research before the first book, and this is years later.
Yeah.
But always this story feels human and curious.
Wow.
I thought this was going to be like an expansion to the previous book. It is not. It's a worthy follow-up.
It's just truly like a second installment of this grand story.
But I also can't imagine the first book without it.
Right, yeah.
It's both. It's just incredible work, and it also feels like a bridge or maybe a deep breath before the jump into book 3.
Sure.
Because Children of Dune feels like a very different sort of thing now. And I have no idea where that's going to go. I know things get weird after that. I think there's another big time jump. But yeah, this was just a startlingly good book.
How far into Children of Dune are you?
1 chapter.
Oh, okay. I couldn't remember. Okay. I knew you read some last night. I just didn't know how many.
Yeah, just one. I was getting tired.
Yeah. Is that the first time that you've read ahead before recording?
It is. That's part of why I stopped.
You cheater. No. Yeah. Well, that's really fantastic. I'm so glad you loved it. And I'm so glad it was playing with all the fun things that you love. And it sounds like it just is... I didn't think you were going to read past Dune Messiah. I figured you would enjoy it and then be done.
Me too.
I didn't think you were going to the next day start reading Children of Dune. So that's pretty cool. Well, you've fully convinced me to read this series. I'm a little bit of ways into Dune, but I will definitely, the next time my brain decides that my hyperfixation hobby is reading, I will pick it back up. Right now I'm stuck on sewing, but I will read it, and I'm very excited to hear or to experience it and get to talk to you about all of this. And of course, I cannot wait when we're going to see Dune Part 2 in a couple days. That's going to be a lot of fun.
And then Part 3, many years from now. I'm very excited to hear the audience's thoughts here.
Yes, I was going to say, that's the other thing I'm excited about, is to hear, you know what, should we open it up for spoilers down below? Or maybe not, in case other listeners and viewers
try to be opaque in your spoilers like I was.
Or if you're going to spoil it, mark it as so. Yeah. But please comment down below. If you've read the whole series and you got something to say, but it's a spoiler, just mark that, et cetera, et cetera. So please, we want to hear your thoughts on the stuff Cam talked about, what you think about the books. Has the movie come out yet by the time you're watching this?
Yes, definitely.
What did you think of the movie? Also, we will do an episode about the movie.
Oh, yeah.
Again, unless
you'll have heard it by now.
Unless we absolutely hate it, we will. Yeah, it's true. In terms of order, it's probably already out. Go check that out. I'm sure it's a great discussion. Who knows? But if you're on YouTube, please subscribe and like this video. It helps us a lot. And if you want to support us even more, or in other ways, you can do so via Patreon. We're patreon.com/secondbreakfastpod. All the info is down below. You get a bonus episode every month, sometimes 2. And you get access to our whole back catalog of bonus episodes that we've been doing for a year and a half now. There's all kinds of stuff in there. It's a lot of fun. And of course, it supports the show, which we really appreciate. Otherwise, if you want to talk to us, you can email us, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. We've also got an Instagram, secondbreakfastpod. And I think that's all the plugs. Thank you guys so much for listening. I'm really... Cam, you were saying yesterday, we probably should have just done Dune as our next series, our chapter by chapter. But I like the way that you're covering it in these larger chunks. Also, I think it sounds like, you're loving these books so much, so you're not having to read at such a slow pace. You got to just devour them.
Yeah,
so that's a lot of fun.
I don't think I knew it consciously, but I think part of me needed to be able to shotgun a series like this.
I think so, yeah.
Because I'm really enjoying the granular way that we're doing Game of Thrones.
Sure, but also every time I finish a Game of Thrones chapter, I'm like, I just want to keep reading. Yeah, because it's so good, and then it's no, I got to stop and do my notes and that's really fun, and it's great and rewarding. But also, I know exactly. What
agree.
You're saying.
I'm glad we did it this way. Yeah, I think I actually preferred it, and I don't know if we're going to do more Dune episodes. Obviously, when the third movie comes out 50 years from now, we'll do that. I don't know if we're going to do more about the Dune books. If I have enough to say, then maybe we'll come back and talk about Children of Dune or any of the other ones. But
this might be it.
And I've totally enjoyed this little 4-episode arc talking about the first 2 Dune books. Yeah. This has been so much fun. Thank you very much for listening, for watching, for joining us and supporting the show. it's wonderful to be able to do this twice a week and dive into art and get so animated about the things we love. So
I do really love doing this. It's a lot of fun.
thank you very much for supporting us any way you can, whether it's a subscription or a Patreon or, whatever works for you. Thank you very much, and we'll be back on Tuesday. No,
Friday.
This was Tuesday. We'll be back on Friday with a brand new Game of Thrones episode. Toodles.
Bye.